What's happening next year?
What we're seeing is admissions officers trying to figure out how to stay ahead of the curve of applicants who are so used to using AI. We are seeing more video questions, more interviews.
If I've just spent hours and hours on my application, what do I do with that, Jessica? I'm scared.
As you should be. And I think international applicants are going to be struggling with, is this country a good place for them to be in? Will there be jobs for them afterwards?
Business school pops a little bit more during recessionary times. People say this is a great time to go hide out in business school and I'll come back just during hiring.
Those of you who are thinking of applying now, remember that maybe 100 seats in your class have been taken for 2 years already.
Right.
It's a new year and a new look and feel for the MBA Mission podcast. We had so much success with a more traditional podcast last year that we've decided to up our game again, delivering a more polished video podcast with some incredible guests ranging from test experts to admissions directors to our very own in-house admission experts. We'll be covering the topics you want, so be sure to leave your recommendations and questions, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. What else is new? I have a co-host, none other than my very first podcast guest and the founder of MBA Mission, Jeremy Shinewald.
Thanks for having me, Harold.
Of course. And on this episode, our very first one of 2025, we're joined by MBA Admissions Executive Director, Jessica Shklar.
Hi.
Jessica has been with MBA Admissions since 2009, and she's basically an industry legend. She has the most 5-star reviews of any admissions consultant on GMAT Club and is a top consultant from Poets and Quants. She's a storytelling expert and has helped hundreds of applicants get into all the top business schools in the US and around the world, including the usual suspects like HBS, Stanford, Wharton, Columbia, Booth, INSEAD, and many, many more. Right now, we're looking at potentially a very mysterious year.
Yeah.
After 2023, 2024, we get to 2025, 2026, and there are already some whisperings about what's going to happen. Let's first off think about macro trends. How are macro trends really impacting application volume? Anything from the economy, which direction is it going? People getting laid off, even AI, which then of course brings us to, I'll call them micro trends. What's happening with the applications themselves? What are your thoughts?
Well, let's start with the macro trends and talk about that for a little bit. And I think there are a lot of different issues going on. One is clearly the effect of the election, the U.S. election. And there's trepidation around that. And I think international applicants are going to be struggling with, is this country a good place for them to be in? Will there be jobs for them afterwards? How should they be thinking about moving to the U.S.? And I'm starting to hear that more and more from my clients, as I'm sure both of you are as well.
Yeah, I mean, I attended a summit recently from GMAT, and they showed data. I wish I could remember the precise amount, but they showed data among internationals. I think it was about 15%. They saw a decline in GMAT test takers.
Which is a leading indicator for application volume, isn't it?
Exactly. So this is during Trump's first term. So I don't know if maybe people have a different understanding. They're accustomed to this at some level. They think that the 4 years will pass quickly, but I would imagine that some similar drop will occur among internationals. Now, depending on your perspective, if you're an international committed to applying in the States, maybe that's a good thing for you. Maybe you're looking around saying, this is my chance to stand out. But I think there are some, apolitically speaking, there is some data that said that last time Trump came in, GMAT test takers declined.
GMAT test takers.
And then they bounced back up.
I was going to say GMAT test takers declined, except do we know how many applicants, international applicants?
I don't know. I don't know if we knew exactly how many international applicants fell off. And again, that's GMAT test takers. That's a view at the entire test-taking population and the entire applicant population. It's possible that at the top schools that we tend to deal with more, the top 15 schools, maybe there's a little less volatility among those programs. But I know that some of the international programs were delighted. Like I know that some of the Canadian and European schools saw application volumes increase, and that made some of those schools more competitive, which again, depending on if you were thinking about applying to INSEAD before, maybe you're like, oh, I'm actually going to have a more competitive pool because of Trump. So it's complicated.
Do you think that works from the flip direction? Are we seeing more Americans thinking about going to European schools as a way of getting away?
That's interesting. Yeah. The one thing I will say, when Trump's during his first term, it's the first time I ever did applications or helped folks with applications from Rotman, from British Columbia, a lot of European applications. So I think we saw it in very real ways here at our firm.
Yeah. And then one of the other big trends that I'm thinking about is that COVID is really in the past now. And COVID impacted volumes tremendously for several years. But now when I think about the essays I'm working on who graduated during COVID. And so our next cycle and the cycle after that will be people who, yes, they were affected by COVID during college, but it didn't affect their working experience quite as much. And so how does that change things? I don't know if that changes their career trajectory, their timing for business school. Remember when we were doing applications right during COVID and asked what every essay was about?
Right.
Thank goodness we're not seeing that anymore.
During COVID, applications went up or went down?
Initially,
or was that the question?
Initially, applications went up a nick at some schools. Right. Keep in mind when it hit in March of 2020, we were kind of through rounds. Like Harvard Business School only has 2 rounds. They were effectively done. And they didn't open up a late round. Some other schools said, we've got to be more flexible. We've got to open up. We've got to extend our year. People haven't had a chance to take tests. That it took a while to get the GMAT online. Ultimately, some schools saw a bit of a pop. But I think it's important to set the context, to create that context that basically, over the 20 plus years that I have been doing this full time, applications to Harvard Business School as a bellwether have been between roughly 9,200 and a little under 10,000 applicants every year. So it fluctuates, 2 or 3% a year, depending on where the economy is. And in the overhang of COVID for 2 years, the only time in my 20 years I've seen a number that didn't start with 9, it went down to about, I think, 8,700 and then 8,200. And people were saying, oh, is an MBA gone? Are people done? And in fact, it was just people were very happy with their work from home life, their job security. And as we'll talk about, a lot of that appears to be gone and a lot of young people rushed back. So last year, we actually reverted to the mean, and there are all these articles written about, the MBA is back and it's surging, but really it just went back to a localized band where I think HBS had about 9,700 applicants last year again, which is right where it should be. So we can certainly talk about where it's going to be going, in general, and not everyone applies to HBS. There are other schools that are maybe a little bit more sensitive to macro trends, but we're, at least for now, you missed your great years to apply. 8,700, 8,200, those are quiet years. And now we're back in a pretty normal cycle.
Couldn't we also say that there was a bubble afterwards, because there were a lot of people who decided they didn't want to go remote, people who deferred if they've been accepted to a school that was then going to be remote, and that took up spaces from those future classes. So there was more constraint for a while there, and I feel like all that's passed, and so now the classes are back to being you apply and then you go, with one big distinction, which is deferred programs, which have really grown. When I joined the company and started in this business, Harvard was pretty much the only one with a deferred program. And now I think there are at least 8 or 10. And so those of you who are thinking of applying now, remember that maybe 100 seats in your class have been taken for 2 years already.
Like Wharton had 60 direct admits from its 60 deferred admits from its MOLIS program in its last class. Wharton has 850 spots. So 60 are gone. It's close to we're nearing 10% that are gone before current applicants even have a chance to get into the pool. And then you look at other specialized programs, like at Wharton, they've got their healthcare management program, they've got their Wharton Law program. And as you start to chip away, you realize that some of these classes are actually a lot smaller. Objects in the mirror, maybe larger than they appear. They're a lot smaller than they appear.
We should probably take a minute, though, and define what we mean by deferred programs. So deferred programs are when you apply as a senior in college. Typically, the deadline is April. I think HBS is still January, but don't quote me on that. And you don't work you don't go to business school right away. You get accepted for a class 2 or 3 years down the road. And you do have to work, and the business school generally has to approve you. Not all programs are structured the same way. For Yale, you join right away, then take 2 years off, and then do another year. But when we talk about deferred programs, and I think all of us by instinct default to calling them 2+2 simply because that was Harvard, which was the first one. We mean seniors in college who get in, but aren't going to start for 2 or 3 or 4 more years.
And if you apply as a deferred applicant, that's not a commitment. You are not, it's not binding. So we're seeing another trend out there. We're seeing a lot of applicants say, okay, well, I better apply when I'm in college, feeling like a little bit of that fear of missing out as their friends start applying. And then maybe they don't get into the top school that they want to, but they're pre-admitted to another school. and then they start applying again in another round, right? So that's a different kind of pressure on that applicant pool. And admissions officers have said to me, they feel like almost part of their job has become making sure their deferred pool doesn't melt away.
That's interesting. And
No,
also,
I
I
can
think
definitely see that.
we used to think of it because of the Harvard program as the 2+2, but actually it could be 2+3 or 4 or even 5 years out. So there's some spillage over that as well.
To what's happening next year. We're hearing a few different things. Regression to the mean as far as the number of applicants. At the same point, the actual class is getting chipped away, whether it's at Wharton with the Louder program, these deferred admission programs.
International volume's changing.
International volume is changing. That's right.
And then so much can be driven also just by the economy, right? Like, so again, trying to be apolitical, but like if there is in fact a massive tariff war, what does that do? I mean, generally speaking, business school pops a little bit more, like we said, during COVID, during recessionary times, people say this is a great time to go hide out in business school and I'll come back just during hiring. So, it's really hard to know what happens with an economy.
Honestly, a lot of things, a lot of different, obviously, different factors are playing a role here. So, Jessica, what's going to happen?
That is such a great question. And
what's going to happen with the entire economy?
And all geopolitical impacts.
Exactly.
And where should I invest my money now?
So obviously, if I knew that, things would be different. And I think that actually brings me exactly to the point I wanted to make to our listeners, or viewers, which is, what does this mean for you? And the bottom line is not that much. You don't have control over any of the things we just discussed. The only thing you have control over is your application and your candidacy. And so you can be aware of these factors, and maybe they would play into what schools you apply to, how safe you go, whether you look at international programs, maybe into your career discussion. But fundamentally, your job is to make yourself the best candidate you can and not worry about these macro trends, which probably leads, not to step on your toes, Harold, to our second point, which is about micro trends.
Yes.
But I would say one other thing, which is that you're not even going to know what that macro trend is until well after you're admitted. So you can guess, oh my God, this year's a really busy. Like I thought that COVID was going to go off the charts bananas. I thought we were going to see 11,000 applicants at Harvard, 12,000 or something like that. Well, Harvard was done, but that type of thing. It just didn't materialize quite that way, and we didn't know that until. It's a small pop at some schools or a bigger pop, but it wasn't crazy. We didn't know that until well after that class was admitted. Like you apply, the class is admitted, and then once they've got all their final numbers, because literally they've got people matriculating on the ground, they can then say, this is our class, and they release data like a month or two after that in October or November of the year after in which you've applied. And so, you don't even know what you're facing.
What we're also seeing in the news is the fact that there have been layoffs in a lot of different parts of the economy. Jeremy, how is that going to affect things?
Yeah, I think on a macro level, we think about the general economic health, but what are the jobs that young people are taking? Young people are generally taking jobs in finance, in technology, in consulting. That's often 65-70% of the class at a top MBA program. And so I would say that the application volumes are actually more sensitive to those three industries than they are to big global economic trends. And there was seemingly big overhiring in consulting for a period.
That's right.
And there are fewer offers to stay. There's less hiring going on. So I think some applicants are starting to, look around and think about their next move towards business school. As we're talking about trends and MBA applications, now would be a great time to get a head start on your MBA applications, and there's really no better way than with an OnTrack subscription. OnTrack is the only highly customizable MBA application platform, and it has tons of resources dedicated to long-term planning, from modules on application timelines and your MBA stats to what it means to apply as someone with your specific background. That's how customizable it is. It'll help you select the right schools, and it'll help you to identify your target MBA goals. Plus, we have more than a dozen modules to help you learn everything you need to know about those target business schools themselves. And those modules go deep, and they get you educated quickly on your target programs. Get started by taking our 2-minute questionnaire to create your personalized learning path unlike anyone else's, and use the code MBAMPOD to get 30% off your subscription.
Okay, Jeremy, so just picking up on what you said, the reality is we are seeing some macro trends. We're seeing macro trends in consulting. We're thinking about macro trends as far as tech goes. Some of it is driven from AI. I think this is a great segue to the second half of our podcast to talk about how is AI going to affect the actual application. Jessica, what are your thoughts?
It's a great question. And we've spoken with several admissions directors who are really struggling with this because the generation that's applying is very comfortable with AI, sometimes more comfortable than the admissions officers are. And so they're trying rapidly to get up to speed. I was at my HBS reunion a couple of months ago, and it was 2 days of workshops and sessions, and I went to 3 sessions solely on AI because my generation, we have to push ourselves to use it. Right. And so this is a case where admissions directors are running behind the applicants on their knowledge and are trying to figure out, what does this look like from an application standpoint? And so what we're seeing is applications really changing to try to get around the AI, the risk that they are being written by AI, more video essays, questions that are multi-part and more complex than we've seen.
Shorter, making them tougher to write.
Yeah. And we'll probably have an entire podcast on AI.
I was going to say,
stay tuned. Because I'm going to say this as a caution. Anytime I mention AI, be really, really careful. We always can tell when something's been written by AI. And in fact, Jeremy did this for us as a team of asking AI to write essays and presenting it at staff meeting, and we all knew instantly, AI is a tool. It is not a substitute for you. So we'll get to that on another podcast.
I was going to say, we're going to talk a lot more about AI at a different podcast. Yeah. What I always tell people, AI is great at getting you to mediocre. Yeah. It doesn't get you to great. It does get you to mediocre.
Right. So what we're seeing is admissions officers trying to figure out how to stay ahead of the curve of applicants who are so used to using AI for papers and whatever else they're doing. So we are seeing more video questions, more interviews,
some scary video questions actually. As we think about the MIT application, towards the end, what pops up then is a quick video on something to be determined. It varies from person to person. If I'm an applicant, if I've just spent hours and hours on my application, what do I do with that, Jessica? I'm scared.
Yeah, absolutely. As you should be, because so first think about, why does the admissions office do this? They're trying to put a name and a face together. They're trying to verify that you are who you say you are. If you have this beautiful, polished essay that's got lots of multisyllabic words and commas and phrases and subclauses, and then you get up and you can't articulate and speak English at all, there's going to be a disconnect. Right. So for that, some reason, it's that. As an applicant, you really also should think about the fact that business schools aren't looking for you to be perfect. They understand that in a video where you have not had any preparation, you're not going to be perfect and articulate. But they're trying to prepare you for any business situation that you might find yourself in. If you get into the elevator and the CEO is the person next to you, you don't have time to prepare a speech and edit it and analyze it. You need to be able to talk off the cuff. If you're at a recruiting event and someone walks by and asks a question, you need to be able to speak quickly and articulately. So business schools are trying to prepare you and assess you on key skills that you need for life. And one of them is the ability to think on your feet. And so it's scary for those of you who've spent lots of time preparing and who are nervous about presenting yourself, as we all were when we went to business school. It is designed for the business schools to test a number of different strengths. One of the things I was told before I started business school from an alum said that the key thing to remember is that the purpose of the case method, which is how Harvard teaches, is that you might be in a finance class and working on a finance case and discover that the problem is in HR. What business school is trying to do is teach you how to think in a multifaceted, non-siloed way. And I think if you take that idea for the application itself and understand that what business school is trying to do is understand what skills you're going to bring to the classroom and to the business world, it helps explain a lot of the admissions process. Because in the real world, when you're giving a presentation, you don't have 900 words to explain an essay. Right. You have 300.
That's right.
And so they're trying to model and sense that you have those skills. Yeah. So that's one key thing we're seeing in business school admissions is more variety in the types of questions. One way AI is affecting the applications is admissions officers trying to get up to speed on it themselves. And also trying to find ways in the application to prevent you from using AI.
I would say, but in fairness, there probably are a few use cases where AI can be a little bit helpful to you. If you wanted to do a whole bunch of interview prep, you could type in, to ChatGPT, give me a long list of MBA interview questions or something like that can help you out.
I'll give you a great example. I have a friend who's a Stanford Business School grad, and she was job hunting a couple of years ago. And so I sat down with her and I talked to her about how do you interview and how do you prepare for interviews. And so I went through with her a lot of the techniques I use with my clients in preparing, where you really go underneath your story and try to understand the motivations behind the bullet points on your resume. And she loved this technique and actually taught it to her executive coach and ended up putting together for herself 30 or 40 pages of stories from her life, of answers to her questions.
Right.
Now she's trying to write a board bio so that she can be interviewed for different boards. Right. So she put into ChatGPT the 30 or 40 pages of self-reflection she had done and her resume and said to ChatGPT, write a board bio for me and identify the kind of places that would be a good fit. And it came out with some amazing stuff. But that's based on a tremendous amount of work on her part first.
Right.
She couldn't just stick a resume in there.
Yeah.
So input is what, and then that's really it. Technology.
It's excellent inputs.
No. And also, honestly, it's really AI does 1,000 Google searches at once. If you look at the output of ChatGPT, it sources everything. So the reality is you could get to the same place if you start using Google for everything, if you use Grammarly for everything. Right. But this is beyond the subject matter of this particular podcast. We are going to be going to talk about AI specifically. But at this point, Jeremy, so tell me, are GMAT norms becoming clearer now?
That's a great question. We have another podcast with Stacey Koprinz coming out soon. She is the head of curriculum at Manhattan Prep, the best GMAT shop in the world. Yes. So let's talk to her about that. But I think for now, first of all, the GMAT changed significantly about a year ago, give or take. And the reason why it changed is because so many people were maxing out on the quant that basically, this is sort of shorthand and a little silly way to say it, but kind of broke the scale.
Right.
And so there wasn't enough differentiation between top scores anymore. And they basically just had to recalibrate the entire thing. Yep. And in doing so, they kind of made some other tests to make it more user-friendly to compete with the GRE, et cetera.
We're talking about the GMAT Focus?
Yes, the GMAT Focus. So if you look at the old GMAT at this point and you look at the new GMAT, there isn't enough data at this point, even having gone through one full class as the schools announced their class profiles that included the GMAT Focus, and they've retired the name of the GMAT Focus, making things more complicated, but we'll use that distinction.
Right.
And so what has happened really at this point is, from an applicant point of view, people are still referencing the old GMAT averages and looking at a GMAT conversion table that's published by GMAC that says an old 740 is a 685 on the new GMAT.
That's right, except then a 750 is a 685.
Right.
The imprecision of that concordance table also adds to the point.
It's a little imprecise, but one thing I would say, if you're looking to understand, if you're taking the new GMAT, which you can only do now, it's really, if it ends in a 5, it's the new GMAT. If it ends in a 0, it's the old GMAT. I think the admissions officers are still sort of in the same world as us. They've been so used to one standard, they're still trying to mentally calibrate and say, what does this mean? This person has a 665, this person has a 635. I bet you they've all got big concordance tables right by their office.
But that's especially true because although business schools started accepting the GMAT Focus in round 2, Harvard and Wharton didn't. And so they have never had applicants with that.
Jessica, let me just ask a question here to pull us back to sort of what's going to happen next year. Yeah. I always think that GMAT, GRE, is it going up every single year? This
the
notion
scores
here,
going up?
Yeah, has that been our experience?
They've kind of, at the top schools, they've kind of plateaued around 740.
740, 163 on each side on the GRE.
The GREs continued to go up over time. From the very beginning, it used to be kind of a workaround, and now it's getting pretty close to maxing out at 165 at some schools, 164, 163. But I think there's still room for it to climb. But I think that's the point. I think the point was there was nowhere for the GMAT GMAT to go anymore. And I don't think they wanted it to go higher per se, but I think that actually could be part of this. I think when people were saying before, like, I've got a 760, like if I retake this, there are only 2 points that I can get, 3 points. It's very rare for someone to get 800. And so now I think it's like, okay, I've got a 685. There are many different rungs on that ladder that I can push you. This could actually, maybe they know, I'm sure they consider this could drive some applicants bananas because they'd be like, I'm so far from the top.
Right. But I think the other thing is we're seeing more tests. Right? We're seeing, it used to be GMAT and some people took the GRE. Then the GRE increased, so it's now roughly 30 to 40% of applicants. Right. Then they launched the executive assessment, which is primarily for EMBAs, but there are more and more 2-year programs that are accepting the EA. And then there are some schools that are waiving the GMAT if you've taken HBS core. Right. So there's more and more flexibility in tests, I think reflecting the fact that the tests are a much bigger deal to applicants than to
that has always been
officers.
We have always had that conversation with our clients. We've always had the conversation with ourselves.
It is so peculiar. It's so peculiar that business schools even require a test, considering, like, if you have a degree in economics,
and you've worked in investment banking,
and you worked in,
and you're 30 years old,
and you worked in consulting, and then industry, and you've got. You've got all this analytical experience behind you. What information do they actually need to say that you can manage analytical work?
And I think that one of the issues we talk about all the time with our clients, I'm sure you guys have this experience, is another 10 points is not going to change your overall profile. If you have a 3.7 GPA and equivalent 730 GMAT, 740, maybe it helps the school's average, but it's not fundamentally going to change your profile. They are looking at your overall academic profile, and it's already really good. Let's move on and focus on other parts of your candidacy.
Okay, so Jessica, that brings us back to the original question. The candidates from year to year, are they looking for different people? Can we say in 2024, they were looking for type A, and in 2025, they're looking for type B? Can we ever get there?
If we could ever get there, it would be a rear view look. Yes. Where we would look, a year down the road and say, oh, this school took fewer consultants. Possibly down the road, we will say, oh, back in 2025, they were taking fewer people from AI. There's absolutely no way to predict that.
A 20-year view of this industry would say that, which I have, I would say the changes are so subtle. It's like when I went in, people had 2 or 3 years of investment banking. Well, private equity boomed, and now it's 2 years of investment banking, 2 or 3 years of private equity. Right. It's like that wasn't driven by admissions. Yeah. That was driven by a change in the way finance works. Right. You had tech hiring was much smaller at the beginning, and it was like a big deal to have programming experience. Then like everyone had programming experience. It's just completely it's not necessarily that appealing to a business school. Now it's like, okay, I've got cutting edge AI experience. Well, maybe that's like a little, if you're really credible, it could be a little helpful to you. But like a lot of people have that too, So the composition of the class is just sort of overwhelmingly consulting, finance, tech.
But does that mean that people who aren't in those fields should run away from it? You brought up a trend when you talked about investment banking and then private equity that we are seeing, which is, it used to be 2 years of work experience and then you apply to business school. And now sometimes we're even seeing 4 years isn't enough. I think the caveat always is it has to be the quality of your experience. Right. But when I joined here and started working in this field, 2 years of really good experience could still make you a credible applicant. Now I look at 2 years of no matter how good the experience is, and it's just not enough.
It has to be something really, really spectacular. There's almost like a proxy for 5 years.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. Just over the last 3, 4, 5 years, I just don't see that many applicants with only 2 years of experience.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't see successful ones.
That's very true too. Yeah. That's very
it's almost like the ones that you see who get in like that have to have, they sort of have more. It's like, well, like I'm 2 years out of school, but I started a business when I was in college. And so I kind of have 4 years of experience. I think that's something really,
and
really
that is how we end up positioning it on the applications because we don't want them to appear, obviously we're positioning it accurately, but we will boost the impact of those college years to try to make a proxy for showing that they have more experience.
Okay. Jeremy, to summarize, can you just take us through some of the macro trends you're seeing big picture things?
I mean, look, the things we've talked about, and I think that overall we're kind of in this very normal band. And so there's a lot of noise. There's AI, and there's the concern about, about tariffs disrupting the economy or some internationals who may fall off. But like, I would expect that we're in a pretty stable area for MBA admissions right now, and that this year might grow or shrink by 1% or 2%, but will probably be more of the same.
Okay, great. Thank you. And now, in summary, what's going to happen with the applications next year, Jessica?
I predict that we will see even more video questions, even more attempts at spontaneity in the application. And I think we're going to continue to see GMAT scores that are increasingly trending towards the GMAT focus or the GRE. And and probably more interesting and shorter questions.
I think the big takeaway that we all can agree on is it's about the quality of your application. The reality is much of this just doesn't matter.
Right.
At the end of the day, for you as an individual candidate, it doesn't matter. You have to do the best possible application you can.
Right. What I tell people when they come onto consultations, free consultations with me, and say, does it matter that I'm from X country, or does it matter that I went to X, didn't go to X kind of school? My first response is, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah,
Right,
change
What
that.
are you going to do
exactly.
about it? And they're like, oh, you're right. I'm like, you can be aware of it. We can mitigate it or emphasize it. But fundamentally, if you cannot change it, there's so much to worry about in the application process.
That's right.
Don't worry about what you can't change.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great then. Well, Jessica,
Thank
you
you
very
guys.
much for joining us.
I appreciate
My
it.
new co-host, Jeremy.
Harold,
welcome
congrats
aboard.
on a fantastic first podcast. Well done, my friend.
Of course. And we now have more podcasts to come. Thank you very much, everyone. It's Harold Simansky at MBA Mission.